Texas, 1944. The sun blazed across a sky so wide it felt endless, burning down on the wire fences and wooden guard towers of Camp Hearn. Dust hung in the air, still as glass, while a dozen German women stood near the corral, bareheaded, silent, squinting at the light. They had expected shackles. Instead, they found saddles. But first, a rancher named Jack Morrison walked forward with bolt cutters in his weathered hands, gestured at the chains binding their wrists, and said words through an interpreter that none of them would ever forget. "You do need this here." Greta Hoffman was 23 when she became a prisoner of war. She'd served in the Luftwaffe as a communications specialist, not flying, not fighting directly, but manning radio equipment at a military airfield outside Berlin. When Allied forces had swept through in the spring of 1944, her unit had been captured intact. Dozens of women suddenly transformed from military personnel into enemy prisoners, from people with purpose into problems requiring bureaucratic solutions. The processing center in France had been the first shock. Stripped of uniforms, dressed in prison clothes marked with large letters identifying them as captured enemy, sorted by nationality and gender in perceived security risk. The men were separated immediately. The women, perhaps 50 from various units, were herded together, chained at the wrists in groups of 4, loaded onto trucks, heading to ports where ships waited to carry them across an ocean most had never seen. The chains were standard procedure, security measures. The women were considered dangerous military personnel trained in technical skills, potential saboteurs, enemy agents who might attempt escape or violence if given opportunity. The chains were cold against skin, heavy in a way that was psychological as much as physical. They clinked with every movement, a constant audible reminder of status, of defeat, of transformation from person to prisoner. Greta's chainmates were Liesel, a nurse from Hamburg who'd served in a field hospital, Margarete, a mechanic from Munich who'd maintained aircraft engines, and Ingrid, a radio operator like Greta from a village near Frankfurt, whose name Greta couldn't pronounce. They didn't know each other before the chains linked them. They would know each other intimately after impossible not to, when every movement required coordination, when sleep meant lying close enough to hear each other's breathing, when privacy became a luxury that chains made impossible. The Atlantic crossing took 3 weeks on a transport ship that had been hastily converted for prisoner transport. The women were kept in a hold below deck, the air thick and stale, the motion of the ship making half of them violently seasick. The chains remained throughout, even in the latrine, even sleeping, even during the 1 hour daily when they were allowed on deck for fresh air and exercise. Greta learned things about her chainmates that intimacy of circumstance revealed. Learned that Liesel cried silently at night, tears for fiancé who died at Stalingrad. Learned that Margarete sang softly when anxious old folk songs from Bavaria that made the other women quiet to listen. Learned that Ingrid was pregnant, perhaps 2 months, showing barely, but sick constantly in ways that transcended seasickness. The pregnancy was discovered during a medical inspection mid-voyage. An American medic, examining prisoners for disease or injury, noticed signs that Ingrid couldn't hide. He spoke to his superior. There was discussion German, English, too fast for Greta to follow with her limited language skills. Then a decision. Ingrid would receive extra rations, vitamins, special consideration for the child's sake, if not her own. This confused Greta. The propaganda had been clear. Americans were brutal. They showed no mercy. They treated prisoners with cruelty, designed to break spirits and bodies. Yet here was a medic concerned about an unborn child, about a German prisoner's health, implementing care that contradicted everything she'd been taught to expect. The contradiction was disorienting. Like learning your native language was spelled wrong, or that north and south had been reversed on every map you'd ever seen. If Americans showed mercy to pregnant prisoners, what else about the propaganda was false? If they treated enemy women with consideration, What did that mean about the righteousness that had justified this war? These thoughts were dangerous. Greta knew it. Questioning the narrative she'd been raised on, educated with, trained under, it felt like betrayal. But the thoughts came anyway, persistent as the seasickness, impossible to suppress completely. They arrived in New York in June 1944. The city rose from the harbor like something from a dream, towers of steel and glass. The Statue of Liberty green against blue sky, ships and docks and activity on a scale that made Berlin seem provincial. The women pressed against portholes, staring at this enemy capital that looked nothing like the decadent wasteland propaganda had described. From New York, they traveled by train PO cars with barred windows and armed guards, across a country that seemed impossible in its vastness. The chains remained. 4 women linked together, moving as unit through processing stations, onto trains, across Pennsylvania and Ohio and Indiana, through landscapes that rolled past the windows like something from a geography textbook come impossibly to life. By the time they reached Texas in late June, the chains had worn grooves in Greta's wrists. Not deep, the metal was smooth enough. The guards had been careful about fit, but visible marks. Nonetheless, red indentations that would fade in weeks, but felt like they'd be permanent, like the experience of being chained was writing itself into her skin. Texas was heat unlike anything Greta had experienced. Germany could be warm in summer, but this was different, a weight to the air. Humidity that made breathing feel like work. Temperatures that climbed past 100 degrees and stayed there for days. The train windows had been opened during travel, but the air coming through was hot as breath, offering movement but not relief. They arrived at Camp Hearn on a Saturday morning, the sun already fierce at 8 o'clock. The camp was new, still being completed, barracks arranged in neat rows, guard towers, raw lumber, wire fences gleaming. Perhaps 4,000 prisoners total, mostly men, Afrika Korps veterans captured in North Africa, but also a section designated for the approximately 100 German women who'd been scattered across various European captures and consolidated here for administrative efficiency. The women were unloaded from the train, still chained, marched through processing, photographed, fingerprinted, assigned numbers, given prison clothes, not the marked ones from France, but simple dresses in drab colors, practical and worn, probably acquired from civilian donations. The clothes were American sizes, which ran larger than German, making most of the women look smaller than they were, like children playing dress-up in adult clothing. The chains remained throughout processing. The women had been chained for 3 weeks, from capture through France, through ocean through America. The weight had become familiar, the restriction almost normal. Greta had stopped noticing the constant clink of metal, had adjusted her movements to account for the reduced range of motion, had learned to sleep despite Liesel's breathing on one side and Margarethi's restlessness on the other. Then they were led to Camp Hearn as main administrative building to meet the work assignment coordinator, a civilian named Jack Morrison, who ran a large cattle ranch southwest of the camp and needed labor to replace the American workers who'd gone to war or defense plants. Morrison was 59, weathered, lean in the way of men who'd worked outdoors their entire lives. He wore rancher clothes, denim jeans, worn boots, a shirt with pearl snaps, a hat that had seen years of sun. He looked at the chained women with an expression that Greta couldn't quite read, surprise maybe, or concern, or something else entirely. An interpreter stood beside him, a German-American from Fredericksburg named Wilhelm Fisher, who spoke both languages fluently, who'd grown up in Texas, but maintained connection to German heritage through parents who'd emigrated in the 1920s. Morrison spoke. Fisher translated. "These women will be working at my ranch. General farm and livestock work. They'll be transported daily, returned evenings. Standard pay deposited to camp accounts per Geneva Convention requirements." The camp commandant nodded. Morrison continued looking at the women at the chains linking them in groups of 4, at the marks on their wrists where metal had worn against skin for weeks. He said something else in English, tone sharp, directed at the commandant. Fisher translated hesitantly. "Mr. Morrison wants to know why they're still chained." "Security protocol," the commandant replied stiffly. "They're enemy military personnel. Trained, potentially dangerous." Morrison said something else, longer, his tone brooking no argument. Fisher's translation was careful. "Mr. Morrison says they're women who'll be working with livestock on his ranch. Says chains are dangerous around animals, could catch on equipment, could cause injury. Says he won't take them in chains. Says if they're dangerous enough to need chaining, they're too dangerous for ranch work and he'll find other labor." The commandant's expression suggested this was an argument he'd had before, with Morrison or others like him, civilian contractors who had leverage through labor shortages and weren't shy about using it. He made a decision, nodded to guards. "Remove the chains." Greta's heart stopped. She'd worn chains for 3 weeks. They'd become part of her body's geography, part of her psychological landscape. The idea of their removal felt impossible, like being told gravity would be suspended or the sun would rise in the west. She'd stopped imagining being unchained, had accepted this restriction as new permanent reality. A guard approached with keys, unlocked the mechanism connecting Greta to Liesel, to Margarethe, to Ingrid. The chains fell away. The sound of metal hitting concrete floor was loud in the sudden silence, echoing off walls, marking a boundary between before and after. Greta stared at her wrists. The grooves were visible, red indentations from weeks of constant pressure. She touched one wrist with the other hand, felt the soreness, the strangeness of unrestricted movement. Lifted both arms experimentally, amazed at the range of motion, at the absence of weight, pulling her back to connection with 3 other women. Around her, the other women were experiencing similar reactions. Some rubbed their wrists gently, nursing soreness. Others stood frozen, overwhelmed by sudden freedom. Ingrid cried silent tears that she wiped away quickly, ashamed of showing emotion, but unable to prevent it. Morrison stepped forward, spoke through Fisher. "You folks will be working at my ranch starting Monday. Good work means good treatment. We don't tolerate troublemaking, but we also don't tolerate mistreatment of workers. You need something, you tell the foreman. You have problems, you report them. You work honest, we'll treat you fair. That's the deal." He paused, looking at each woman in turn, then added, "And you don't need chains here. Not on my ranch. Not for the work we do. Your people first, prisoners second. Remember that." Fisher's translation of that last part was uncertain, as if he wasn't sure he'd heard correctly, or wasn't sure how to convey the sentiment in German without making it sound absurd. Your people first, prisoners second. The words were radical, revolutionary. They contradicted the entire framework of military prisoner management, suggested a hierarchy of identity that military systems were designed to suppress. Greta would think about those words for days afterward, would turn them over in her mind like a puzzle with pieces that didn't quite fit. People first, prisoners second. As if identity was negotiable. As if the uniforms and capture and chains had been temporary impositions rather than fundamental transformations. That night, in the women's barracks at Camp Hearn, Greta lay on her bunk alone, no chains connecting her to others, able to move freely for the first time in weeks. She couldn't sleep. The freedom was disorienting. She kept reaching for chains that weren't there, kept expecting to feel the pull of Liesel's movements on her left, Margarethe's on her right. Liesel, in the next bunk, whispered in the darkness, "You awake?" "Yes." "Can't sleep either?" "No." Pause. Then, "What do you think of the rancher, Morrison?" Greta considered. "Don't know. He removed the chains. That could be tactic. Make us trust him. Lower our guard. Maybe or maybe." Greta stopped, uncertain how to articulate the thought. Maybe he just believed we didn't need them. Liesel was quiet. Then, if they don't train us, they don't fear us. If they don't fear us, what does that mean about everything we were told? Greta had no answer. The question was too large, implications too significant. If American captors showed mercy, if Texas ranchers treated enemy prisoners as people first, if the chains came off and the sky didn't fall, what did any of it mean about the righteousness of the cause they'd served the propaganda they'd believed the war they'd lost? Monday morning arrived with heat already building, the sun climbing over endless horizon, turning dew to steam that rose from grass in shimmering waves. 12 German women were loaded into the back of a truck, no chains, just guards with rifles who looked bored rather than vigilant, and driven 12 miles southwest to Morrison Ranch. The ranch was vast. 5,000 acres of rolling pasture land, cattle scattered across distances that made them look like toys, fences running to horizons, windmills turning lazily in morning breeze. The main house was white-clapboard with a wide porch, surrounded by ancient oaks. Barns and corrals clustered nearby, painted red, wood silvered by decades of sun. Morrison met them in the yard, introduced his foreman, Tom Rawlings, a lean man in his 50s who'd worked this ranch for 30 years. Introduced several ranch hands, all older men or teenagers, the men of prime working age having gone to war or defense plants, leaving ranches desperately short of labor. Fisher translated as Morrison explained the day's work. The women would be divided into groups. Some would work in the vegetable garden that supplied the ranch household and could provide produce to sell in town. Others would help with livestock feeding, watering, general maintenance. Still others would assist with fence repair, a never-ending task on a ranch this size, where cattle and weather constantly tested the wire. Greta was assigned to livestock work with 5 other women, including Liesel and Margarete. Ingrid, because of her pregnancy, was given lighter duty in the garden. They were issued work gloves, heavy leather, worn but functional, too large for women's hands, but serviceable. Morrison demonstrated how to hay-fork feed into troughs, how to pump water into tanks, how to move around cattle safely. The work was hard, physically demanding in ways military service hadn't been. Communications and radio operation required mental focus, but not muscle. This was different lifting hay bales, hauling water buckets, walking miles across pasture, checking fence lines and cattle. By mid-morning, Greta's back ached. By noon, her hands were blistered despite gloves. But she wasn't chained. That awareness returned constantly, surprising her with its intensity. Every movement reaching for hay, stretching to fill a water tank, walking freely across open ground, was a reminder of freedom she'd stopped expecting. The grooves on her wrists were fading, the redness diminishing, but the memory of chains persisted, making their absence feel miraculous rather than normal. At noon, Morrison's wife brought lunch sandwiches, lemonade, fruit. The women ate in the shade of a live oak, guards nearby, but not hovering. Mrs. Morrison was a practical woman in her 50s, kind-eyed, who served food without comment, but with small gestures that conveyed respect, placing plates rather than dropping them, making sure everyone had enough, bringing extra lemonade when the first pitcher emptied. The lemonade was remarkable, cold, sweet, shocking after weeks of tepid water and coffee that tasted like industrial runoff. Greta drank slowly, trying to make it last, trying to memorize this taste because it felt like kindness made liquid, like proof that the world contained sweetness, even in captivity. Margarete spoke quietly. This is strange. All of it. The ranch, the work, the food, the way they treat us. Like people, Liesel said softly. Like we're just workers rather than enemies. Because maybe here we are, Greta replied. Maybe the war is somewhere else. Maybe on this ranch, we're just people who need work, and they're just people who need workers. The others were quiet, considering. The interpretation was both simple and radical. If nationality and war could be temporarily suspended, If enemy status was contextual rather than absolute, then everything they'd been taught about fixed identities and permanent categories was suspect. The afternoon brought different work. Morrison needed help with a newborn calf whose mother had died during birthing. The calf was weak, struggling, needed bottle feeding every few hours to survive. He asked for volunteers, and Greta's hand went up before she'd consciously decided to raise it. Morrison showed her how to mix formula, how to hold the bottle at correct angle, how to be patient while the calf learned to suck. The calf was all legs and big eyes, desperate for nourishment, latching onto the bottle with intensity that made Greta's heart ache with unexpected tenderness. She'd never been maternal, never particularly liked children or animals, had never imagined herself as caretaker for anything beyond radio equipment and organizational systems. But this calf needed her. Its survival depended on her patience, her attention, her willingness to sit in a barn holding a bottle steady while a baby animal learned to trust her. The calf drank greedily, milk disappearing from the bottle, its tail twitching with satisfaction. When it finished, it looked at Greta with eyes that held no judgment, no awareness of nationality or war or enemy status. Just gratitude for food and the warm presence of someone who'd helped. Morrison watched from the barn entrance, said something to Fisher, who translated, "That calf won't forget you. They remember who feeds them. You'll be its person now." Greta felt something crack inside her chest. Not break, but open. Some defensive barrier she'd maintained since capture, some wall between herself and her circumstances, suddenly had a fissure letting light through. She was this calf's person. Not prisoner number 2847. Not enemy German. Not radio operator or military personnel, or any of the categories that had defined her for years. Just the person who fed this animal, who would feed it tomorrow and the day after, who mattered to this small life in a way that was uncomplicated and true. She nodded to Morrison, not trusting herself to speak, afraid her voice would reveal too much emotion. He seemed to understand, nodded back, and left her alone with the calf. The weeks that followed established routine. Days at Morrison Ranch, evenings back at Camp Hearn. Work that was physically demanding, but psychologically restorative, providing purpose and exhaustion in equal measure. The German women became known quantities to the ranch hands, evolved from dangerous enemy prisoners to Greta Dash, who dash feeds dash the dash orphan dash calves. LIESEL dash, who dash has dash medical dash training dash, and dash help dash, that dash hand dash who dash cut dash himself. Margareta Dash, who dash fix dash, the dash tractor dash. Names instead of numbers. Skills instead of threat levels. Individuals instead of categories. The transformation wasn't universal or simple. Some women maintained strict distance, refused to engage beyond minimum required interaction, saw every kindness as manipulation or tactical advantage-seeking. Others embraced the opportunity too eagerly, perhaps, became overly familiar in ways that made guards and ranch hands uncomfortable. But most found middle ground working honestly, accepting kindness cautiously, building tentative connections across the gulf of language and nationality and war. Greta's English improved rapidly, motivated by practical necessity and aided by daily exposure. She learned ranch vocabulary, corral, pasture, windmill, feed, water, fence. Learned to understand Tom Rawlings's drawling accent, learned the different tones Morrison used for approval versus correction versus humor. She learned to ride. This happened unexpectedly. When Morrison needed someone to help move cattle from one pasture to another, and his usual hands were occupied elsewhere. He looked at Greta, at her competence with animals, at the way she moved around cattle without fear or hesitation, and asked Fisher to translate. "You ever ride a horse?" "No," Greta admitted. "Want to learn?" She did, desperately. Riding represented freedom in a way that even removed chains hadn't quite captured. Sitting on a horse, moving across open range, feeling the animal's power channeled through her decisions, it was intoxicating. Morrison started her on an old mare named Patience, aptly named Placid and forgiving of novice mistakes. He taught her basics: how to mount, how to sit, how to hold reins, how to communicate with the horse through subtle shifts of weight and pressure. The first ride was terrifying and thrilling in equal measure. The height, the movement, the sensation of being carried by a living creature that could choose to cooperate or rebel. But Patience was patient, and Greta was determined. By the third lesson, she could walk confidently. By the fifth, she could trot without panic. By the 10th, Morrison trusted her enough to help with actual cattle work, moving small groups between pastures, doing simple tasks that freed up experienced hands for more complex work. The other ranch hands accepted this with varying reactions. Some were impressed the German radio operator turned cowgirl, learning to ride well enough to be useful. Others were skeptical, questioned whether prisoners should be trusted with horses, whether the security risk was acceptable, whether Morrison was being too lenient. But Morrison's authority on his own ranch was absolute, and the labor shortage was real. If a German prisoner could ride well enough to move cattle, that was one fewer task demanding his limited workforce's attention. Pragmatism trumped ideology. Necessity overrode suspicion. By August, Greta was spending most ranch days on horseback. The work suited her in ways office work and radio operation never had. There was something clarifying about physical labor under open sky, about working with animals that responded to competence rather than rank, about tasks with immediate visible results rather than abstract strategic goals. She learned the ranch's geography, every pasture, every water source, every gate and fence line. Learned which cattle were calm and which were ornery, which needed watching and which could be ignored. Learned to read weather in cloud formations and wind direction. Learned to judge time by sun position and cattle behavior. Most surprisingly, she became friends with Tom Rawlings. It happened gradually, through shared work rather than deliberate socializing. Tom was a man of few words, but the words he spoke were considered and usually wise. He'd worked this ranch since he was 16, knew every inch of it, understood cattle and horses and land in ways that came from decades of attention. He didn't care that Greta was German, didn't care about the war or politics or ideology, cared whether she worked honestly, treated animals well, pulled her weight. By those measures, she was acceptable. Better than acceptable, she was good at the work, quick to learn, willing to do difficult tasks without complaint. One afternoon, moving cattle through a difficult gate, Tom said to her in his slow drawl, "You got a feel for this. Most folks need years to develop what you picked up in weeks. You grow up around animals?" "No," Greta replied in her accented English. "Grew up in Berlin. No animals except street cats." Tom considered this. "Berlin. That's a big city, right?" "Very big. He was quiet, processing. "Then, what brought you to Texas?" "The war," Greta said simply. Tom nodded slowly. "Suppose that's true for most folks here." He paused, then added, "War's a stupid way to run a world. Takes people who could be doing good work and makes them do violence instead. Makes everybody worse off." Greta had no argument. The observation was so obviously true that elaboration seemed unnecessary. They worked in companionable silence after that, but something had shifted. Tom had acknowledged her as person first, prisoner second. Had recognized shared values, honest work, animal welfare, the waste inherent in war that transcended national boundaries. Had offered, in his understated way, the radical gift of seeing her clearly. That evening, Liesel asked Greta, "What do you think about after the war? Assuming we survive. Assuming Germany survives. What then?" Greta had been thinking about this. "I don't know if I can go back to radio work, to military anything." After this she gestured vaguely, encompassing the ranch, the work. The unexpected peace she'd found in physical labor after this, sitting in bunkers listening to frequencies, feels wrong. Feels like being buried alive. So what instead? Maybe something like this. Working with animals. Physical work. Something real. Liesel smiled sadly. That's the rancher's influence talking. Morrison has converted you to his church of cattle and open spaces. Maybe, Greta admitted. Or maybe I was always suited for this, and just never had opportunity to discover it. Maybe the war, despite everything terrible, led me to something I wouldn't have found otherwise. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Greta had been captured, chained, imprisoned, transported across an ocean, and in the process, had discovered work that felt more meaningful than anything she'd done as free woman in Germany. The chains had led to freedom of a different kind. The defeat had opened possibilities. Victory never would have. September brought cooler temperatures and the beginning of fall work. Morrison needed help preparing for winter repairing shelters, stacking hay, ensuring water systems could handle freezing temperatures that Texas winters occasionally produced. The work was hard, but satisfying. Greta had developed muscles she'd never known she could possess, developed calluses that turned her hands rough and capable. She was stronger than she'd ever been, both physically and psychologically. The woman who'd been chained on a ship 3 months earlier felt like a different person, like someone she'd been before becoming herself. One afternoon, Morrison gathered all the German women who'd been working regularly at his ranch. 12 women, standing in the barn, tired from a day's work but attentive. Fisher translated as Morrison spoke. "You folks have been working here 3 months now. Good work, honest work. Some of you have become genuinely skilled at ranch tasks." He nodded at Greta. "And some of you have made other contributions I appreciate." He paused, seemed to be choosing words carefully. Then continued, "I want you to know something. When you first arrived, chained, looking half-starved and terrified, I wasn't sure this would work. Wasn't sure prisoners would work honestly without chains and constant oversight. Wasn't sure Germans would accept direction from Americans. Wasn't sure the security concerns were overblown or justified." He paused again. "But you've proved something important. Proved that people are people, regardless of what side of a war they're on. Proved that given decent treatment and meaningful work, most folks will respond with decent effort. Proved that chains and fear aren't necessary for good work, just respect and fair dealing." Fisher translated carefully, and Greta watched the women's faces as understanding dawned. What Morrison was saying wasn't just personal gratitude. It was philosophical statement about human nature, about the possibilities for connection across enemy lines, about the bankruptcy of systems built on fear and restriction. Morrison wasn't finished. He continued, "The war will end eventually. You'll go home. What happens there, I don't know. But I want you to remember something. You're not prisoners first. You're not Germans first. You're people first. People with skills and dignity and value that exists independent of nations or wars or chains." He gestured at Greta specifically. "You became a cowgirl in Texas. That's strange, unlikely, probably wasn't in any plan you made for your life. But you did it. Became good at it. That's who you are, someone capable of learning, adapting, doing difficult work with competence and grace." Fisher's voice cracked slightly, translating that last part. The compliment was so unexpected, so genuine, that it carried weight beyond mere words. Morrison concluded, "When you go home, don't forget your people first. Don't let anyone, government, military, whoever reduce you to just nationality or just war enemy or just whatever category they want to stuff you into. You're more than categories. Remember that." Silence followed. The women stood in the barn, dust motes drifting in slanting afternoon light, absorbing words that felt simultaneously obvious and revolutionary. Of course they were people, but also after years of propaganda, military service, reduction to numbers and functions and enemy designations, Being told they were people first felt like revelation. Greta felt tears threatening, forced them back through sheer will. She would not cry, would not give Morrison the satisfaction of seeing how completely his words had devastated her defenses, how thoroughly he'd articulated something she'd been feeling but couldn't name. That evening, back at Camp Hearn, the women who worked at Morrison Ranch gathered informally in the barracks. They talked about the day, about Morrison's speech, about what it meant. Margarethe said what others were thinking. He removed our chains on the first day. That was the message then. Today, he just put it into words. We don't need chains because we're people, not just prisoners. He's been treating us that way all along. Today, he just made it explicit. Do you think other ranchers are like this? Someone asked. Other American employers? Some yes, some no, Liesel replied. We've been lucky with Morrison. But I've heard stories from other work details. Some Americans are cruel, some indifferent, some kind. It varies like it would anywhere, with any people. That's the point, though, Greta said slowly. They vary. They're individuals, not just Americans. Not just enemies. Individuals with different characters and values. Just like we're not just Germans, we're individuals. The conversation continued late into the night. Women processing the cognitive dissonance of being treated humanely by people they'd been taught to see as inhuman. Processing the collapse of propaganda in the face of experienced reality. Processing the possibility that everything they'd believed about enemies and war and national identity might be more complicated than military training had suggested. In May 1945, Germany surrendered. The news reached Camp Hearn through official channels' commandant's announcement, formal notification. The war in Europe concluded. The reaction among prisoners was mixed. Some were relieved finally over, survival assured. Others were devastated defeat absolute, homeland destroyed. Most felt numb, too overwhelmed to process what it meant. Greta felt oddly disconnected. The war had been happening somewhere else for so long distant abstraction, while she fed calves and rode horses and learned to repair fence. Its end was theoretically significant, but practically changed little. She was still prisoner, still in Texas, still working at Morrison Ranch. The war's conclusion didn't immediately alter daily life, but gradually changes accumulated. Talk of repatriation, processing for return to Germany, sorting through millions of displaced persons and prisoners to return them to homelands that had been transformed by defeat and occupation. The prospect of return was complicated. What was Greta returning to? Berlin was occupied, divided, reportedly in ruins. Her parents were missing. Last letter had been months ago. Communication, since then, impossible. Her apartment was almost certainly destroyed. Her job no longer existed. The country she'd left in 1944 had ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. Morrison learned about the impending repatriation from camp authorities. He arranged a final gathering at the ranch for all the German women who'd worked there, now 20, as the labor program had expanded. He provided a meal barbecue, potato salad, pie, food in quantities that were generous rather than merely adequate. He spoke briefly, Fisher translating. You folks are going home soon. I'm glad for you. Home is important, even when home is complicated. But I want you to know you'll be missed here. You did good work. Made this ranch run better than it has in years. Some of you, he looked at Greta, became genuinely skilled at work. I didn't think city folks could learn. He paused, emotional in a way that Texan reserve usually prevented. Then added, I hope you remember Texas kindly. Hope you remember that Americans treated you fairly. Hope when someone asks about your time as prisoner, you can say honestly that you were respected here. That you weren't chained. That you were people first. The women received small gifts, each a set of work gloves, leather-worn but functional, and a handwritten note from Morrison expressing gratitude for their work. Greta's note included an additional line. We welcome back if you ever want to visit. A cowgirl always has a place on this ranch. She folded the note carefully, put it in her pocket next to the only photograph she had from Germany, her parents, taken before the war, smiling at a camera in a world that no longer existed. Greta was repatriated in August 1945. The process was bureaucratic and slow trains to ports, ships across Atlantic, arrival in a Germany that was barely recognizable. The country was divided into occupation zones, infrastructure shattered, economy collapsed. Hamburg, where she disembarked, was a wasteland of rubble where a city had been. She found her way to Berlin's difficult journey through broken transport systems, through zones controlled by different powers, through checkpoints and paperwork and officials who viewed returning prisoners with suspicion or indifference. Berlin was worse than she'd imagined. The city center was moonscape. Her family's apartment building had been hit by bombs, reduced to rubble and twisted steel. Her parents were dead. She learned this from neighbors who'd survived, who told her they'd died in air raid in February, buried in mass grave with hundreds of others. She was alone, completely alone. 24 years old, in a destroyed city, without family or home or job prospects. Around her, millions of other Germans were navigating similar situations. Defeat, loss, the grinding work of survival in circumstances that made survival seem impossible. But Greta had something many didn't. She had memories of Texas. She had skills learned on Morrison Ranch. She had the radical knowledge that people were people first, that nationality and war were temporary impositions rather than permanent identities. That chains could be removed by someone who said, "You don't need this here." She found work helping with reconstruction. Physical labor, just like the ranch hauling rubble, clearing streets, the endless work of transforming ruins back into city. The work was hard, but Greta was strong now, capable in ways she hadn't been before Texas. Her hands were calloused. Her back was strong. She could work full days without breaking. She also found other returned prisoners, other women who'd been in American camps, who'd worked on ranches or farms or in factories, who'd experienced treatment that contradicted propaganda. They formed informal networks, shared resources and information, helped each other navigate the chaos of post-war Germany. One evening, Greta met Liesel again, purely by chance, in a bread line in the American sector of Berlin. They recognized each other immediately, embraced with emotion that surprised both of them. They'd been chainmates, had been closer than intimate during weeks of being literally connected, then separated after Texas without proper goodbyes. They talked for hours, sharing stories of return, of what they'd found and lost. Liesel's fiancé was confirmed dead. Her family home in Hamburg was destroyed. She was working as nurse in a hospital barely functioning, treating patients with inadequate supplies and overwhelming need. "Do you think about Texas?" Liesel asked. "Every day," Greta admitted. "About the ranch, the work, the way Morrison treated us." "Do you regret coming back?" Greta considered. "No. This is home, even as ruins. These are my people, even in defeat. But I'm grateful for Texas. Grateful for learning I was stronger than I thought. Grateful for the chains being removed. Grateful for Morrison saying we were people first." Liesel nodded. "That's what I remember most clearly. Not the work or the food or even the kindness. Just that moment when the chains came off and Morrison said we didn't need them. Like he was giving us back something that had been taken. Not just freedom from chains, but freedom to be people rather than just prisoners." They parted with promises to stay in contact, to help each other when possible, to remember that they were people first individuals with value independent of national catastrophes or military defeats. Greta Weber lived in Berlin for the rest of her life, watching the city rebuild from ruins into something modern and strange and German, but transformed. She worked various jobs. Reconstruction labor gave way to office work as the economy recovered, eventually returning to technical work that utilized her communications training. She never married, never had children, built a life that was independent and purposeful, contributing to Germany's reconstruction and eventually its prosperity. She learned to ride again. There were stables outside Berlin where horses could be rented, where former radio operators could remember being cowgirls in Texas. She maintained correspondence with several women from Camp Hearn, comparing experiences of return, of rebuilding, of navigating post-war life. Most had similar stories: loss, difficulty, the grinding work of survival, transforming gradually into possibility of normalcy. In 1965, 20 years after the war's end, Greta received a letter from Texas, from Jack Morrison, now 79, writing to tell her that he often wondered what became of the German women who worked his ranch, hoped they'd survived and prospered. She wrote back immediately, described her life in Berlin, her work, her survival and recovery, thanked him for treatment that had been humane when humanity seemed absent, for removing chains when security protocols said they were necessary, for insisting she was person first. Morrison replied, "That wasn't generosity. That was just decency. You folks worked hard, deserved to be treated with respect. The chains were always wrong practically, wrong morally. I'm glad you remember it meant something. Glad you survived." They corresponded sporadically over the years. Short letters, occasional updates, connection maintained across oceans and decades. Morrison died in 1972, and his daughter sent Greta a copy of his obituary along with a note. Dad spoke often of the German women who worked the ranch during the war. Said they'd taught him something important about human nature, about the possibility for decency even in war, about people being people regardless of uniforms or nationalities. Thank you for that. Greta kept the letter, kept the work gloves Morrison had given her in 1945, worn and useless but precious. Kept the memory of chains falling away, of a rancher saying, "You don't need this here," of learning she was stronger and more capable than she'd ever imagined. When German friends asked about her time as prisoner of war, she told the story carefully. Told about capture and chains and Atlantic crossing. Told about arriving in Texas expecting cruelty. Told about Morrison removing the chains on the first day, about learning to ride, about feeding orphan calves, about being treated as person first. The story surprised many Germans, contradicted their understanding of how prisoners were treated, challenged assumptions about American behavior, complicated the simple narratives about victors and vanquished. But Greta insisted on the truth of it. Morrison had been real. His kindness had been real. The removal of chains had been real. She lived until 1998, dying at 77 in Berlin, having witnessed Germany's division and reunification, having contributed to its transformation from ruins to prosperity. In her possessions, her nieces found the worn work gloves, Morrison's letters, a photograph of herself on horseback in Texas that she never mentioned evidence of a story she told, but whose emotional weight she kept private. The photograph showed a young woman on a horse, squinting at the camera in bright Texas sun, wearing work clothes and a slight smile. She looked competent, confident, free, no chains visible anywhere in the frame. On the back, in Morrison's handwriting, Greta Weber, cowgirl, June 1945. Proof that people are people first, everything else second. This is what happened when German female POWs arrived in Texas in chains. Cowboys removed them. Not because security protocols changed. Not because the women were harmless. But because someone decided chains weren't necessary for people doing honest work. That human dignity was more important than security theater. That individuals deserved to be seen as people first. That decision to remove chains, to offer work instead of just imprisonment, to treat enemies as human, didn't change the war, didn't alter the grand sweep of history. But it changed Greta Weber, changed Liesel and Margarevi and Ingrid and the others who worked Morrison Ranch. taught them that humanity persisted even in war, that individuals could transcend national categories, that chains were removable by anyone willing to say, "You don't need this here." The war ended. The prisoners returned. Germany rebuilt. But the memory of chains falling away remained a tangible reminder that even in darkness, even as enemies, even as prisoners, people could be treated as people first. That dignity could be offered rather than earned. That freedom sometimes came from unexpected sources in improbable places. "You don't need this here." 4 words that removed chains, that changed lives, that proved humanity was stronger than war if individuals chose to honor it. 4 words that German women carried home to ruins, that sustained them through rebuilding, that reminded them they were capable and valuable and worthy of respect, regardless of defeat or national catastrophe. People first, everything else second. The rancher's philosophy, expressed through bolt cutters and removed chains, and the radical act of trusting enemies to work without restraints. It was small gesture in the context of total war. But to the women whose wrists it freed, it was everything.